Okay, this is a really exciting moment because we have two Sarahs with no H. Like, how
hmm
often does that happen? So if anyone says anything, you'll be asking Castro the questions, I'm sure, but you can, use lingo and call us by our last names to be clear if you want. Oop. So I am so excited for today. I want to start off with as I usually do, let's go to the beginning. And Sara Castro, I know you grew up in Tempe. You told me you were a Senate page, and you went to ASU intending to go into politics. Can you just take us through that beginning of time, like Flynn, before you entered Flynn, and what was behind your choices and where you went to school and what
Yeah,
did you major in? I know it's a
sure. So this is a long time ago. I was a 95 Flynn. Before we get started, I just want to thank the foundation for hosting us. Thank Anne and your entire team. And thank you especially for hooking me up with Sara. We've become friends already. And so really glad to be here. And then secondly, I just want to mention that I'm here in my personal capacity answering questions just as an individual. So I don't my views don't represent the Department of Defense, the Space Force that I'm currently helping out, or any other federal agency that I previously worked for. So, getting back to Tempe, I went to McClintock High School, graduated from there in 1995. Had spent some time in DC as a Senate page and was really hoping to get into politics and journalism. So I started at Arizona State as a journalism major. Um, so I was planning to major in journalism. I think you mentioned in social media promotions that I was dared by the dean of the Honors College at the time, Ted Humphrey, who some of you may remember. I was talking to him about my freshman year schedule and struggling a little bit with what foreign language I was going to take. I had taken Latin all through high school, and my school didn't have the AP test, so I had to take more foreign language. And I was like, I think I'm going to take Spanish. I'm a little bored with it. He dared me to take Chinese, and taking Chinese for the first time as a freshman in college is a major undertaking. It was then, it still is. It was a 5 credit class. It was a major portion of my time. And luckily, I really enjoyed it. As hard as it was, I really, really enjoyed it. And it became an addictive part of my college that the further I got into it, the more it pulled me away from my original goals into something new. So I kept taking journalism classes. I worked on the ASU newspaper for a while. I did some other things related to print journalism my first 2 years in school. But when it came time to travel, that is really when I became pulled in a new direction. So I ended up spending over a calendar year studying and traveling in the People's Republic of China. So it started out that with my Flynn money, I was planning to spend the summer, and it was the summer between, it would have been after my sophomore year. So that program was booked. I had paid the deposit. It was ready to go. I had also put in an application for what was then known as the National Security Education Program. Now it's more commonly known as the Boren Scholarship, which for current scholars on the call, if you don't know about this, let's talk about it more in the Q&A because it's a really amazing program. And so that program pays for American college students to spend an academic year in a non-Western, non-English speaking place and learn deeply about the culture and language of that place. And so I ended up getting that scholarship. So I had funding for an academic year on top of my Flynn summer. And I ended up spending from as soon as school ended that sophomore year, all the way through the year and most of the following summer in the People's Republic. And so I spent semesters in Beijing and this other city in the far north called Harbin, it's actually north of Korea. It's near the Russian border. And I traveled to about 40 other cities in the PRC and Tibet. and working on my language, talking to people. Even if I wanted to not talk to them, they tended to want to talk to me and answering a lot of questions about the US, learning a lot about China. And so it was the experience of a lifetime, and it really, really changed what I wanted to do when I came back. So, for
So when you,
one thing, go ahead.
sorry,
Yeah.
on that point, like so that was almost 30 years ago,
Yeah.
and you had total different experience in China than what, say, current students could experience in
Oh,
China.
yes.
What do you
Yes.
think you were able to see that, current students will probably never see? Whether, however
Yeah.
you want to take that question.
Yeah. So there were a lot of things that I think have changed, especially in the major cities. In So I was there in the 97, 98 school year. And so China had subways. China had long distance phone calls. China had a little bit of the internet. So the university that I was at in Harbin is sort of similar to like Caltech. It's one of the top polytechnic schools, schools of engineering in China, still today. And they had like one computer lab where we could do Telnet. So us older alums on the call will remember Telnet. The current scholars will maybe understand that it's a command line system of email. Basically, it's all text, is all black and white, and you could send email this way. It did not look like your current emails. Like there's no sending pictures at all. And so we could do that in one lab on this like polytechnic campus for a couple of hours a week. We were able to do that, so I could send email. So in terms of like what I saw in China that I think is really hard to see now, um, a lot of the surveillance state that exists now didn't exist then. Most of it. The surveillance state was mostly just people looking at me because they'd never seen an American before. So there was that. But in terms of like the government surveillance, it was much, much less noticeable for everybody. And then there were a lot of other things about daily life. So um, nobody drank the water in China.
Hmm.
Like the municipal water systems did not provide potable water, even for Chinese citizens. So that was unique. Other places in the world I traveled, like the following summer, I went to India, and in India, all the Indians drank the water. It was just me that was like an outcast. But in China, nobody drank the water. So there was this whole system of whatever building you lived in, they would have a person that was responsible for the water boiler, and they would have a set of people that would bring around a thermos of boiled water to your room, and you would swap out these thermoses every day, and that was your water for the day. So I think systems like that are not something that people see anymore unless you're in an extremely rural area. So a lot of that kind of old PRC was still in place when I was there. So
You
I
went
think that
to,
deepened my education about it, right? So over the 30 years watching that, all that change.
and
So
truly, that's still the case in some countries that I've been to somewhat recently. So I think China has really pushed public systems, in terms of their economic playbook. It kind of brings everybody up when a country does that. Um,
yeah, agree.
you went to India, right? So if you're willing to share it, I'd love to hear your one story from your trip that you tell people on Halloween. Is that something?
Yes. I have a ghost story that I like to tell my undergraduate classes when I have to teach on Halloween. So, so I spent the whole academic year in China. I came back. I had still had 2 more years of Flinn funding at ASU. So I took 2 semesters of whatever I did, completing my degree, and then I had a little bit more Flinn money, and I spent it doing senior honors research in India in the summer of '99. And my professor, at that time, I ended up graduating with a degree in religious studies and a double major in history. focused on East Asia and a minor in Chinese. So for the religious studies senior thesis, my professor just said, go in every religious institution that will let you in and ask a lot of questions. That was my assignment for this 3 month summer. And so I had planned to study Tibetan Buddhism because I'd just come back from Tibet and I went in every Tibetan temple that I could find. But I also visited the city of Varanasi, which is a really famous Hindu holy site. And it is known in Hinduism as the place where it is the best place to be buried and have a funeral. And so, even if you've only encountered studies of India a little bit, if you've watched a PBS special about India, you've probably seen this part of the Ganges where they have the funeral pyres and they burn bodies of deceased loved ones and have a funeral that way. So I turned up in this city, and there's really no internet. The internet is just barely with us. So all of us used to do this kind of backpacking travel with a travel book, a travel guide. So I had a Lonely Planet travel guide. And, this is an entire city that is basically run by the funeral industry. And the funeral industry in India is not really all that different than the funeral industry everywhere else. And it, makes money off of funerals, right? And the tourism and the travel that came with that in this place. And so the people who worked in tourism in this place, the thing that they would do is get the Lonely Planet book and they would look and see what hotels were highly ranked by the Lonely Planet book. And then they would name their hotel something very similar. And then they would pay these guys to meet you at the train station. And when you asked for a ride to the hotel, you want to go to the Shanti Hotel, and they'd say the new Shanti Hotel. And you're like, yeah, sure, the new Shanti Hotel. And then they'd take you to this completely different place than you thought where you're going. And so that happened to me. And I end up in this hotel and I'm checking out the hotel. And it's actually really nice. And it's really nice for whatever little bit of money I was paying for it. And I had my own room and I had my own bathroom. And I was like, this is great. I should have known. And, meanwhile, and I'm by myself, right? So I go out to try to get dinner and I kept getting lost. Like I have this map in the book where I think I'm supposed to be. I'm just not in that place at all. So I come back and I'm like, well, that was frustrating. And, I go to sleep. And every time I close my eyes in this room, I see flames and this older man, and he's yelling at me. He's yelling at me really loud. And it's really scary because it's not like a dream. It's like, it's not there when I open my eyes, but it's like real flames, man yelling at me. And this is terrifying. And I'm by myself. And, it's like the late at night and in this city that I don't understand. So I turn on my light and I sit on the chair in the chair on the corner and I read the rest of the night. And I'm like, as soon as the sun comes up, I'm out of this place. So I pack up all my things and I go downstairs to check out. And there is one of those easels with a picture of a person and flowers hanging off of it, like at a funeral. And it's the man. It's the man who was behind my eyes all night screaming at me. And I'm pretty sure that this hotel was also a funeral home and it was having this man had come there to die and they were having his funeral. They had his funeral. And
Not
they
happy that you were there.
oh no. And they put me in this room, I'm sure, because I'm this, rich foreigner who comes into town, whatever. So I got out of there. And yeah, so things like that happened to me
Right.
summer.
Moral of the story is that I was a very analytical person. I still am, but in school, super analytical. Things happen that analytical brains can't explain, and we all
Yes,
need to be open to that. That's number one.
yes,
And then the second thing is, every country you go to, like the taxi drivers will try to take advantage of you. So you Flinn scholars who are traveling for the first time, whether it's price, whether it's a funky meter, whether it's where you're going, you have Google Maps now. Use them.
yes, yes.
Uh,
You have to ask a lot of questions and just get to know people where you are for sure.
that's
So,
crazy. So you
yeah,
walked in later to, I think you said the Fletcher School for your master's degree. So I'm going
Yeah.
to jump
So,
straight to the CIA.
yep.
Can you take us through how you end up meeting a CIA recruiter, and then what is an actual job of a CIA analyst when you get there? Like we
Yeah.
see, TV shows with charts and network analysis and all that. Like, what's real, what's not? Like, take us to
Yeah.
that spot.
Okay. Sure. So, I graduated Arizona State in 2000, and I wasn't ready to go right to graduate school. So one of my mentors at Arizona State helped me find a job at this NGO in New York. An NGO is a non-governmental organization. And so I was there. I was there for a couple of years, helping them with what's called Track Two diplomacy. So, Track One is like the head of state meets the head of state. That's Track One. Track Two is other groups from these two countries have some kind of bilateral engagement. And so, this organization I was working for, they did all sorts of different Track Two dialogues. They had groups of Supreme Court justices from Chinese provinces meet Supreme Court justices from U.S. states. They had internship programs in this. So I was working there on U.S. China relations when September 11th happened. And that's what made me want to go back to grad school and kind of pivot my career into public service more directly. And so I got into the Fletcher School. I was doing an MA in law and diplomacy, which is what the MA is called. And if you're not familiar with the Fletcher School, it's one of these. It's a professional school of international affairs. So there's a whole consortium of these schools. There are many of them around the country. So some of the ones that you might have heard of, the Kennedy School at Harvard, SEPA at Columbia, Johns Hopkins SAIS, similar to that. So it was a 2-year program. My very first semester, the Career Center hosted a CIA team of recruiters that came, and they gave some job talks and they interviewed people. And so they interviewed me. They were in the midst of a hiring surge on China at the time. And so I was hired as part of that. And they actually offered me an internship. So I went as a graduate intern. And at the time, I was like, this is great. I can do this internship. And if I don't like it, I can walk away. Nobody really walks away for several reasons. One is if you're interested enough to go there in the first place, then you usually find that the work is addictive and you don't want to leave. But the second reason is the work is also a lifestyle. It is all inclusive, and most people who get into it just don't want to get out of it right away. So I did the graduate fellowship. I was really impressed with the people I met there. Some of the most brilliant people that I've ever worked with work there. And so I decided to continue my career there. I went back, I finished my degree, came back on full time, and stayed there until 2009. So the work of an analyst, you were asking about that. So, I was a desk jockey. I wasn't operational. My job was to read all of the things that came in, wherever they came from, on my assigned issues and figure out what was a threat to the United States, what parts of it answered questions that policymakers were having, which came to us in a variety of ways, and to write analytic products in support of answers to these questions, and sometimes to deliver oral briefings to top level policymakers on these strategic issues. Um, so they were long days, and especially if you work on, an Asia Pacific country, the time zone is off, 12 hours or more from Washington. And so the news is happening during Washington's overnight, right? So the morning was an especially busy time because we're sort of coming in, finding out what had happened all day in East Asia and processing those things for the White House and the cabinet secretaries and sometimes Congress, sometimes the military. For the issues that I worked on, which were mostly politics and leadership, my customers were mostly cabinet secretaries and the White House. And so sometimes something happens that you have to tell those customers about right away that day. And so you and the team, your teammates, work really hard to finish that product that day. A lot of times you're working on longer things, or there's little bits of information that are coming in to build a story that you tell them in some other kind of a product. Um, and then a lot of times they're just calling to ask for help or to ask particular questions, and you're writing something or creating a briefing that is responding directly to those. Um, so the parts of it that are very different from TV, I think even now after all these years, the computer systems are better on TV. So yeah, there's a, tends to be a lag, and the priority is computer security over computer speed, computer effectiveness, computer aesthetics. So computers always look different when I watch the shows. The other thing that's different, I think, is I was very surprised how rare it was that there was sort of a smoking gun in the classified information, right? I can't say a lot about the classified information, but what I can say is, and this is something that I think people that I talk to about this work don't always know, it's not classified because it's interesting. It's classified because of how it was obtained, right? So either the technical tools that allowed it to be obtained or the person who allowed it to be obtained, those are the reasons why it's classified. It's classified to protect those sources and methods. And then it's classified because the nature of the information could be damaging to the US.
Right.
So sometimes within those parameters, it's also interesting, but most of the time, if something came in that met all three, the sources need to be protected, the information was damaging, and it was also interesting, I'd also probably have to give you a 30-minute brief to tell you why I thought it was interesting. So,
Uh,
like the idea of stuff coming in and it's like the smoking gun and we got to run up to the president, not really. So, the other thing that is relevant to my work now as a historian is that you're basically collecting all of this gossip, right? And some of it is more solid and accurate than others, but it all is basically gossip. And you're sort of weighing, what can we piece together with this that makes us feel confident in answering just the questions about which there's the most uncertainty in the world, right? Like these really existential questions that there's no certainty in the answer. And so sometimes the best stuff comes from a human source. Sometimes the best stuff comes from a satellite, but it varies. And really, in order to tell a story with any confidence, you kind of need all of it. So that's something that was really surprising to me, and that I think doesn't always come through in the spy movies, is that you're really doing this kind of critical thinking where you're weighing all these evidence and all these different voices to create a coherent story. And you're thinking very carefully about which pieces of this can I be confident in my assessment, and which pieces of this am I less confident? Which pieces of this, if it changed, it would change the whole assessment. It's that kind of work.
and then all of that is really in the context of your own knowledge, life, and experience, right? Because you're creating a story based on all the stuff you've learned. So I'm guessing like you now versus you then with the same set of information would even create a bigger context in that. And that's hard
Yeah.
to communicate to the bosses at the time.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting that you raise that, because one of the things that I realized there is that you can give 10 individuals a stack of documents and you will get 10 different assessments, right? And everything that I wrote there was a corporate product that was coordinated with everyone else that had a stake in whatever I was saying, right?
Hmm.
And I had a stake in whatever they were saying. And so that system has developed over the years. I mean, now, intelligence history is a thing I study, But that system has developed that way over the years so that the analytic product is heavily coordinated, right? And the places where there's significant disagreement are noted for the customer. And the places where everyone feels pretty confident in a consensus are the main line of it.
And so
So
how do you get evaluated? Like how do you get promoted at the CIA in
yeah.
this job?
So part of it is your substance knowledge. Part of it is your ability to work with other people, right? And a way that you can get fired is not being able to, responsibly handle the information that you're getting and the sensitivity of it. But promotions come from your depth of knowledge, your ability to create assessments that are responsive to policymaker needs and actionable. Um, it's interesting. Accountability has been something that has evolved over the years in U.S. intelligence. And this has been a push pull between the intelligence community agencies and Congress, and how oversight works and how accountability works. But in general, these systems, and this is not unique to the US, the systems work better when there's um, substantial, clearly communicated rules of engagement and then limited individual accountability, right? And this is especially true for operations. Nations have found that if they're if their spies and their operators who are going out to do this work are feeling like, ooh, I might not want to do that. I might not want to do that because I might get in trouble. I might get fired. That backfires. So they find other systems of accountability. And that is global, that is historical. So that's part of why I think this work becomes a lifestyle for people, because there's this system and rules of engagement and things that are norms, okay to do, not okay to do, when you're being trusted to do this very difficult work that is important and uncertain.
Right. And what do you a different angle of, difficulty is briefing, really senior people like a president or a vice president. For me, whenever I didn't brief the president, but when I've had those kind of serious presentations I have to do, it helps me that I know my material, but still it can be nerve-wracking. So, did you get training as part of your job and like this is how you're supposed to brief? And, what would you tell people that are listening that like to prepare for those kind of moments? Because we all have one. It could be president, it could be your current boss, it doesn't matter. But like how
Yeah.
that because that can be very nerve-wracking.
So we had extensive training in briefing, and we had extensive training in analysis, hours and hours. And, my time there started off with a 5 month full time training program that
Mm.
covered all of the things that I needed to do in the job. So, and there was retraining constantly. And some of it was on the job with mentorship, and some of it was in formal classes. So, and the way that briefing works, um, the points that you brief are coordinated just like a written product. So you go in with a plan of what you're going to say and where your assessments come from in terms of, analytic evidence and reasoning. And those things have all been approved by your team and your manager and all the way up. So that helps. You have that level of preparation, right? Um, and usually you're not by yourself. Usually you're with a partner. The way the president gets briefed changes. It's sort of at the pleasure of the president and according to their personality. And usually, now this can change. This is just norms, but the president is assigned one or two briefers at a time. So they have a couple of briefers, and there's been books about this that you can read, that any of you can read if you're interested. And so that person gets to know the president, and that is their job, to brief that person orally. And so everyone's contributing to the product that the White House sees, but the actual person that's going to interact in that conversation, that is a job that's assigned. It's a rotation. So I never did that job.
Ah,
Um, but I did brief cabinet secretaries, and I briefed other principals. And so, it sounds more formal than it usually is. It's usually you are sitting at a table with them, and you're usually lucky if you get out your first paragraph of prepared remarks before they start just asking the questions that they have. And so you want to be prepared enough to do that. If it is a more formal situation, one tip that I found that I give my students is, don't try to have a script, right? If you're going to have a script, you better just prepare it so it's almost memorized. Because what happens in like a short notice kind of conversational brief is that you'll just lose your place, and then you'll be all jammed up, and you can't find where you were, and you can't find the
be
place
awkward
again.
and embarrassing and yeah.
Exactly. So it's much better if you're going to be in one of these informal conversations and you haven't had time to like memorize a whole like oratory, to just have bullet points, or just have an outline of, I know I need to hit these points, so that if you get interrupted, if you get a question that you have to answer the last part first, that you see what the other parts were right in front of you.
Yeah, I think
So that's the
that's good.
thing I learned. Yeah.
And then, so I know you ended up at UNC Chapel Hill, but part of it was, I think if I remember correctly, you were chasing the answer to a question that you didn't feel like you could do. And I mean, that's normal. You have to go to a university and be paid to answer big picture questions. Can you talk about your journey and
Yeah.
what pushed you out of
Sure.
the pull more
Yeah.
than the push?
Yeah. So, all the intelligence agencies tend to answer questions that are about, day-to-day strategic issues, right? And so maybe you're looking very short term, maybe you're looking a few years out, but you're dealing with sort of actionable policymaker issues. That's the kinds of questions that they're mostly asking you, that you can mostly answer in that job. And what I found was, as I was having more and more of these briefing conversations with policymakers, we would answer their actionable questions. And then at the end of it, what they would want to know is, why is China still communist? They had a lot of questions about the ideology, and are the leaders there committed to it? How committed are they? What even is it? What is this system? And so that wasn't really a question that I could answer in that job. That job just was not set up to answer that question. But the more people asked me about it, the more curious I got about it. And especially after my early experience of just being welcomed by people over there, right? So I went to do my PhD to sort of answer that question. I started the PhD in 2009. So it's been some years. I have a better answer to the question. I'm still working on it. I'm getting there. It's a really big question. It's a really big question.
And
So,
so, what did when you let's go straight to an angle of that question because you wrote a book. So tell us about the
yeah,
book that you wrote. And then in that context, because I know it's about the U.S. intelligence and this is, World War II type. For those of us, including me, who haven't thought deeply about this period, why do you think it's relevant today? And is there stuff we're trying to figure out about China then that we're still trying to figure out the same thing? It might be related to your question that you're still on the search for, but like, can you give us a little bit of your China lens through
sure.
book for those of
Yeah.
us who read it?
Yeah. So the book is called Mission to Mao, and it came out in September of 2024. It's published by Georgetown. And it talks about the first sustained engagement between U.S. Intelligence officials. Some of them were from the military, some of them were from this organization called the Office of Strategic Services, which was sort of the first non-military U.S. intelligence organization during World War II. And so there was a crew of them, and they were embedded with the Chinese Communist Party at the Chinese Communist Party headquarters at this place called Yan'an. And so that mission of Americans lasted from 1944 to 1947, which are really interesting dates because it's sort of not the beginning of the American experience of World War II, sort of toward the end. And it also crosses over the Japanese surrender and the end of World War II. So this incident is called the Dixie Mission. The mission became known as the Dixie Mission. It had other names, and they kept changing the words on them. So I think everyone just remembers it as the Dixie Mission, which was originally sort of a code word when they founded it. And it referred to two things. One was this song about the American South. It was a popular song. And, it was about what's it really like in the American South. And then this whole idea of Dixie as this rebel territory during the Civil War. So it was a code word that the officers who thought up the mission were using amongst themselves, and it just kind of stuck. So this mission was secret for a long time, but American historians and Chinese historians knew about it forever. A lot of different people wrote about it over the years. And their main question was this the time when the U.S. lost China? That was the first question. The second question they had was this a lost chance for the U.S. in China? That the U.S. could have engaged the communists and they blew it. And I think historians in the late 90s and the early aughts kind of dismissed both of those questions when more Chinese materials became available. And just the whole idea of America being able to manipulate this place one way or the other became passe, right? So I think now we all sort of think, well, it wasn't really America's to win or lose, right?
We're not the center of the universe.
Right. So that's just not a question that animates historians in the same way that it used to. But what interested me about it is what it said about World War II intelligence and World War II intelligence, especially in this really unusual relationship with this group of people that at the time, no one in the US had really ever heard of. They end up 5 years later becoming the leader of mainland China, right? So that the whole dynamics of that, what is US intelligence doing in that? How is US intelligence, developing over the war? And how is that playing out in this unique place? So one of the issues that is happening in historians in and out of China right now is that there's no access to the Chinese archives. The access to, ephemeral information or any kind of conversational information, non-published books that Chinese leaders left behind, very, very limited for everyone. And that's not just a me problem, although I have extra limitations traveling there right now. So the Chinese side of this story is something that I hope some other researchers someday will be able to tell a lot better than I could. So what I focused on was just the American story and what this story could tell us about World War II, about this early relationship with the Chinese Communist Party. And I was surprised to find how much it told me about American air power and the development of that and the importance of that. And that was probably one of the main reasons why Mao Zedong allowed this group of Americans to come, is because they had a plane and that gave him access to things that he didn't have otherwise. So those are some of the things that I learned about it. And, I think thinking about those questions about did the US lose China? Was it a lost chance? One of the things that struck me about that question is that nothing about the relationship, one way or the other, was really inevitable. And what I really saw was just, two groups of people in a mess that were trying to get Japan out of this country, right? And they related to each other, like people that were focused on that mission for a long time. And that makes it seem really unusual to us with all that has passed between 1945 and now, right? That's when you look at those sort of contemporaneous experiences of these people, it seems really strange to us because now there's so much water under the bridge.
It's kind of like the enemy is my friend
That's
momentarily.
exactly, yes. And sometimes they even would say, and I don't even think they were thinking in terms of enemy.
Enemy,
It was, for the US, the CCP was just an unknown, right?
right?
And so they were there to learn about the CCP, to learn what the CCP guerrillas were doing against Japan, and to see if the US could and should amplify that in any way or help it, or if it was being effective, or if they could copy it, and these kinds of things. So it's very focused on the war at first.
I
Um,
think, I mean, I am for sure not a China expert, though I'm very curious. I still feel like it's hard to know China. And part of that is the language, and part of that is the access to information and the drive. But like now, you in your various stages, you've taught regular university students, and then you've taught military university students, and you're still in that kind of space, which we should get into in a second. But or what does it mean to teach future military officers about China now? Like
mhm.
total
Yeah.
different climate. Like how would you even approach that question? I'm curious.
Yeah. So one of the things that has been really interesting over my career is that when I started out in 2000 or whatever it was, if I was talking to a crowd of Americans about China, and I asked that crowd to raise their hands, how many of you think China's a threat? I get maybe 10%, right? Now it's the reverse. Some things about China have changed, but actually, their grand strategy has been pretty consistent. So this is more of a change here,
More
I think,
perspective.
right? And more of a people in the U.S. have watched this modernization that China said they were going to do a long time ago. Now it's actually happening, right? So I think a thing that I have encountered in the classroom is students that come with a lot of preconceptions about what that modernization means, especially if they're military students, right? And one of the vectors that that usually takes is a real focus on Chinese foreign policy. And I would say that that focus even takes the form of assuming that all of China's policy is foreign policy. That is a thing that American students that I've encountered often do. And so part of my job is often just reminding people that actually Xi Jinping has many audiences, and most of the time America is not one of them. And he is responding just like any, head of state would, to domestic considerations that sometimes become foreign, right? And so recognizing what are the domestic considerations? How do those sometimes bleed over into national security priorities? That's something that I spend a lot of time in teaching and writing on right now. And I think it is very dangerous, right? So if you're watching China and you're assuming every decision they make is foreign focused, and a lot of those decisions are focused on the US, there's a real opportunity for cognitive bias, like traditional cognitive bias, to enter the picture. So you are thinking that because China is doing this thing, if I was doing this thing, if the US was doing this thing, this is what it would mean, right? So mirror imaging or these other kinds of confirmation bias and things. And so I think that those are traps for people that are just getting into this without trying to see Chinese strategy on its own terms. Or, what are the domestic problems that Xi Jinping has to think about in China? Even as simple as what is the geography of this place? What's
Hmm.
the population of this place? What's the square acreage of this place? What is the land like? What are their traditional geographic strategic concerns? Some of those very basic things, um, once you consider them, some of what's happening makes a lot more sense. And I think it also can seem a little bit less threatening.
So on that note specifically, so like in my job, my of investing, I would be I would task myself with creating an economic playbook or something similar, and to what are the priorities of the decision makers of this country? What is their framework? So then I could try to guess when something happened that tomorrow, or, the US invades Iran or something, then I had some context for like, why does this country care? What would they might do, etc. Can you take us through, and I'm probably taking a 3 hour answer and asking you to do it in 5 minutes. Can you give us like major tenets of like, what do you believe, Sara Castro, Chinese historian and military teacher, what do you believe are the prime directives of Xi Jinping when he's looking at running China in whatever way he does?
Yeah. So, in the interest of time, I could probably write a book about this, or we could
Exactly.
write that together.
Part two.
So,
And
so I
yeah.
think it helps to be a historian in answering this question, because I think what I see are more continuities than something that's new even to the party, right? So resources are always an issue. So China has, I mean, the number of people in China is very difficult to count, but it is over a billion. It's probably 1.5 billion people living there. It's about the same square mileage as the US. The US has 350 million people or less in the same area. The other thing that's interesting about China is that a lot of that land is not usable for farming, right? It's a desert, or it's 12,000 feet elevation or above. And so you have this enormous population shoved into a really small, you know, set of arable land. And so resources have always been something that Chinese leaders had to think about. And I think that's no different for Xi Jinping. One of the things that is different for him than maybe for Chinese emperors in dynasties in the past is that the world has changed, right? So the way technology operates, um, the existence of nuclear weapons, the size of something like the US military, and how it might feel about his government, that is something new that he has to worry about. But I don't think he's necessarily taking a fundamentally different approach than the four top CCP leaders who preceded him did, right? So they all have the same idea about deterrence, and the basic principles of Chinese foreign policy and grand strategy at their core haven't really changed since Mao. How he's implementing them changes.
Mhm.
So, does that answer your question?
Yes,
So,
but I'm the follow-on thing, and I don't even know if there's an answer. It's just since the United States is at war at the moment, it just befuddles me as to understand, like, what does it mean? Like, if China is worried about US militarily or vice versa, like, what does it mean to be conquered against that foe? Because I don't imagine the US wants to like take over and run China or vice versa. Like, how do you approach that from like your intelligence perspective or your history perspective? Like, is it just human nature that we all seem to need to have enemies? It's kind of philosophical, but it just puzzles me. Like, what is the ultimate end game here in terms of like, oh, we have to defend ourselves from the US or China? Do you have any
yeah,
on that?
yeah. So I think it's a complicated question, but um, I think it's actually pretty difficult for leaders on both sides of the Pacific also to answer this question, right? And especially as much as the economies overlap now, right? Where
Yeah, we need each other.
um yeah, and it's really difficult to even tell the source of products now, right? So when I was in North Carolina, I remember going to this conference on US China relations that was state focused, and there's a lot of furniture makers in North Carolina. And one of the things that they were talking about is that their product is neither American nor Chinese, because they do this thing where they like make the raw materials in North Carolina, they send them to China, China does some things with them. They dye them or they, construct them, and then they come back to North Carolina where they're assembled, right? So is that a Chinese product? Is that an American product? And
Exactly.
a lot of products are like this now. And it's not just with China, right? It's a globalized economy. And so I think that makes these kind of all conquering wars much more difficult for us to imagine how it would start, how it would proceed, how it would end, right?
Mm,
And I think we're
yeah.
all experiencing that as we watch the news lately. And certainly when you're thinking about these, you know, near peer powers or strategic competitors or whatever the U.S. government wants to call them, it's really really difficult to imagine um, that kind of engagement happening anymore.
Yeah. It's kind of like, why and where would it lead us? Nowhere good. So I know we're running out of time, but I wanted to end in like a little bit more personal on your side because you do have you're a human being, not just a history teacher. Um, you do have daughters, and I'm curious, like, what would you want your daughters to understand about the world that you wish more Americans understood from your perspective?
So I think a thing I come back to with them is that people aren't all that different in different countries, and certainly on the individual level, individual families all want the same kind of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what form that takes and what language you speak about it in and what government makes you feel comfortable, those things are a little bit different. But certainly a thing that I learned from my travel is that, you know, people aren't all that different.
Mm-hmm.
The outside trappings of it might change, but
We
humans are
we all
humans,
have our
right?
values. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think as it becomes more of this globalized economy, it's easier to forget that in a way, and it's more and more important to remember it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Okay, I have one last question. So the Flynn Scholarship dared you inadvertently, with Dr. Humphrey. Literally someone dared you and it changed your whole trajectory. If you could dare a current Flynn Scholar to do one uncomfortable thing that might reshape their trajectory, what would it be? It's a hard
Mm,
question. I should have given it to you in advance, but
yes. One uncomfortable thing. Well, so different people are uncomfortable with different things,
different things,
right?
exactly. So maybe it's something,
Um,
do something you're afraid of.
yeah, but so a thing that I notice as a person who has worked a lot with undergraduates, this current generational cohort doesn't always like to do things in person.
Mm,
That's not necessarily the comfort zone, right? So if you have a conflict with a company, um, I've noticed that this generational cohort is more likely to do the online chat with the customer service representatives than to call, and certainly more likely even to call than to go in person, right? But face to face interactions are different. They're different. So, I think showing up for things in person, if that's not something that's in their comfort zone, that would be something I recommend um, as an old fogey.
Well, I agree with you on that. All right. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and we're gonna wrap up our recorded session of this podcast.